These are called Inca bones. They are found in the royal Inca people, but also clearly here in the Paracas as well. The elongated skulls of Paracas, Peru, who died out 2,000 years ago.
In 1928, a forgotten desert in Peru coughed up a secret no one was ready for. Hundreds of ancient skulls, all impossibly elongated, buried beneath vibrant cloth more intricate than anything the Inca ever made. Some had no sutures. Some had brain cavities 25% larger than normal. Scientists tried to explain it away as headbinding, until DNA tests revealed something no one saw coming.
Some initial DNA testing has been done, and the results, according to the geneticist, are quite startling. There were certain segments of the DNA that didn't match anything known to be human.
What they found in those bones could rewrite everything we thought we knew about ancient humanity. A desert secret unearthed. The Paracas Peninsula in Peru is a harsh, beautiful, and lonely landscape. It's a place where the desert meets the sea. The sun is relentless, the wind is constant, and the sand seems to go on forever. It feels like the end of the world. And back in 1928, that's exactly what most people thought it was. A barren wasteland with nothing to offer. But one man saw something else. His name was Julio Tello, a Peruvian archaeologist often referred to as the father of Peruvian archaeology. He was a man passionate about his country's past, and he believed the desert was hiding a secret. He had heard local stories, whispers of ancient things buried beneath the sand. So he began to dig. What he found would change everything. It wasn't just a few bones or broken pottery. Tello and his team uncovered an enormous, intricate burial complex. These weren't simple graves. The locals called them cholpas, deep, stone-lined tombs built underground, like a hidden city of the dead. It was a labyrinth, filled with the remains of a forgotten people. As they carefully brushed away the dust of centuries, the scale of the find became clear. There weren't just a few bodies here. There were hundreds. Later estimates would put the number at over 300. This was no ordinary cemetery. This was a necropolis, a final resting place for what seemed to be an entire society of elites. But the real shock came when they looked closer at the skeletons themselves. The skulls were wrong. They weren't the shape you'd expect. They were bizarrely, impossibly long, stretched back and upwards, defying everything we know about human anatomy. And these weren't just cast aside. Each one of these individuals had been treated with immense care and respect. Their heads were meticulously wrapped in layer upon layer of some of the most beautiful and complex textiles ever found in the ancient world. They were buried with treasures, ceremonial blades, and fine jewelry, telling a clear story of power, wealth, and importance. In that moment, staring into those dark tombs, Julio Tello knew he had stumbled upon something monumental. This was a civilization that predated the famous Incas by thousands of years. The Paracas culture was real, and it was sophisticated. But the question hung in the dry desert air, a mystery wrapped in exquisite cloth. Why? Why would this powerful, advanced society deliberately shape the heads of their children into these strange, elongated forms? This was the secret the desert had kept for nearly 3,000 years. And this was the mystery that would launch a debate that continues to this day. The cultural code. So we're left with these bizarre, elongated skulls. The immediate question, the one that probably popped into your head, is how on earth did they do this? And more importantly, why? Let's tackle the how first, because it's actually the most straightforward part of the mystery. The practice is known as artificial cranial deformation, and while it sounds complex, the concept is simple. It all comes down to one key fact. A baby's skull is not a single solid piece of bone. For the first few years of life, the bones of the skull are soft, pliable plates connected by soft spots, or fontanelles. This is nature's design, allowing the baby's head to be somewhat squashed during birth, and for the brain to grow rapidly afterward. The Paracas and many other cultures saw this natural malleability as an opportunity. Right from the moment a child was born, they would begin a gentle but persistent process of shaping. They would tightly bind the infant's head with cloth, or sometimes place it between two flat pieces of wood, secured with cords. This wasn't a one-time event. It was a constant, gentle pressure applied over years, from infancy through early childhood. Think of it like a tree growing around a fence. The skull, growing and developing under this constant pressure, was gradually guided into an elongated conical shape. The bones literally remodeled themselves to fill the space allowed by the bindings. By the time the child was around 3 years old, the skull bones would begin to fuse and the new shape was permanent. It was a lifelong, unchangeable mark. Now, if this sounds like a bizarre one-off practice from some lost tribe, here's the part that often surprises people. It was incredibly widespread. This wasn't just a Paracas idea. Halfway across the world, in ancient Egypt, royalty like King Tutankhamun and his family were depicted with elongated heads. Across the Atlantic, the Maya of Central America practiced it, binding their children's heads to create a sloping forehead, which they considered beautiful and a sign of high status. Even today, in parts of Vanuatu in the South Pacific, a form of head binding is practiced as a powerful cultural tradition. So the how is clear. But this global practice brings us back to the most important question: why? Why would cultures with no contact with each other all independently decide to do this? The answer lies in the power of symbols. In the ancient world, your body was a canvas for your identity. An elongated head wasn't a hidden secret. It was a public, permanent billboard. It was a physical signifier that screamed your place in the world from the moment you walked into a room. For the Paracas, it was likely the ultimate mark of the elite. If you had an elongated head, it meant you were born into the ruling class, the priests, the nobles, the rulers. It was a sign of power, pure and simple. It set you visually apart from the common people, the farmers and fishermen whose heads were normal. It was a way of saying, "We are not like you. We are born to lead." But it probably went even deeper than just social status. Many anthropologists believe the shape was deeply spiritual. Perhaps they were trying to emulate their gods or deified ancestors, who they believed had naturally elongated heads. By shaping their children's skulls, they were making them look more divine, granting them a closer connection to the spiritual world and perhaps even greater intelligence. The head, after all, houses the mind. Reshaping it could have been seen as reshaping the very vessel of the soul, creating a person who was not just a leader, but a bridge between humanity and the gods. This is the mainstream scientific consensus. The Paracas skulls are a dramatic, extreme, and fascinating example of artificial cranial deformation. The individuals in those tombs were human beings who, from their very first breath, were sculpted by their culture to fulfill a specific high-status role. Their families invested years in this process, binding them not just with cloth, but with an entire identity. So, case closed, right? It was all cultural. If only it were that simple. This is where the plot thickens. Because when some researchers looked closer at the Paracas skulls, they began to notice a few things that didn't quite add up. Features that seemed to go beyond what simple head binding could achieve. They suggested the difference wasn't cultural. And that is where our story takes its next intriguing turn. Pushing the limits of the possible. So, if head binding was such a common practice, why are the Paracas skulls so famous? Why do they continue to spark such intense debate, even when we have a perfectly good explanation? Well, this is where the story gets complicated. Because a number of researchers and investigators, like author Brian Forrester, have looked at these skulls and said, "Wait a minute, not so fast." They began to point out specific physical features that, in their view, don't quite fit the standard head binding story. They argued that some of these skulls seem to be built differently from the ground up. Let's walk through their main arguments. The first and most dramatic claim is about size. Some researchers have measured these skulls and suggested they have a much larger cranial volume, the space inside the skull that holds the brain. One often repeated figure is that they could be up to 25% larger than a typical human skull, If true, that would be monumental. Headbinding can change the shape of the skull, but it shouldn't dramatically increase its total internal volume. This led to a provocative question. Could these people have naturally had bigger brains? The second anomaly is a bit more technical but just as intriguing. It's about a small hole at the base of the skull called the foramen magnum. This is the opening where the spinal cord connects to the brain. In a normal human skull, this hole is positioned in a specific way to balance our head on our spine for upright walking. In some of the most extreme Paracas skulls, it's claimed this foramen magnum is positioned further back, closer to the rear of the skull. For critics of the headbinding theory, this is a big deal. They argue that external pressure from boards and cloth shouldn't be able to move the location of this fundamental anatomical anchor point. Then there's the issue of the sutures themselves. Remember those lines that connect the bony plates of a baby's skull? The main one that runs from the front to the back is called the sagittal suture. In many of the Paracas skulls, this suture appears to be faint or even completely missing. The argument goes that in a normally deformed skull, you would still expect to see evidence of this suture, even if the bones are pushed out of shape. Its apparent absence in so many specimens has been used to suggest that the skulls simply grew this way naturally. These are powerful points. They seem to point towards something other. They suggest that perhaps the Paracas elite weren't just shaping their heads, but that they were born with a natural predisposition for this form. It's a theory that captures the imagination. But now, we have to bring in the other side of the scientific conversation. What does mainstream bioarchaeology have to say about these so-called anomalies? First, the claim of increased cranial volume. Mainstream scientists urge caution here. They point out that when you elongate a skull, you're stretching it out, which can create an illusion of greater size. It's like stretching a balloon. It gets longer but also thinner. The dramatic 25% figure is highly contested and is not supported by any rigorous peer-reviewed scientific literature. In fact, most careful bioarchaeological studies confirm the internal volume falls within the normal human range or is sometimes even slightly smaller due to the constrictive nature of the deformation process. Similarly, the shifted foramen magnum is a well-understood consequence of extreme, sustained pressure on an infant's growing skull. When force is applied from the front and back, the entire cranial base is remodeled, which can alter the apparent position of this opening. It's not that the foramen magnum itself moves, but that the bone structure around it is transformed during development. And finally, the missing sagittal suture. This has a medical explanation, a condition called craniosynostosis. This is a real known phenomenon where the sutures of an infant's skull fuse prematurely. It can happen naturally, and when it does, it can itself cause the skull to grow into an elongated or misshapen form as the brain pushes against the already fused bones. It's entirely possible that some Paracas individuals had this condition, which would have been seen not as a defect but as a divine sign, making them perfect candidates for further elite headbinding. In other cases, the extreme deformation process itself could have caused the suture to fuse or become obscured over a lifetime. So, in one corner, you have investigators pointing to physical oddities as proof that the headbinding explanation is incomplete. In the other, you have scientists arguing that these oddities have well-understood explanations within human anatomy and the known effects of deformation. It's a dialogue. It's a tug-of-war between observation and interpretation. But to truly settle the debate, to move beyond arguing about bone structure, we need a different kind of evidence. Evidence that can't be shaped by boards or cloth. Evidence written into the very blueprint of life itself. We need to look at their DNA. The genetic breakthrough. Getting DNA from a 3,000-year-old bone in a desert is one of the most delicate challenges in modern science. Time breaks DNA down into tiny, shattered fragments. To succeed, scientists had to become detectives. They entered sterile labs, suited up in full-body gear to ensure not a single speck of their own skin or breath could contaminate the samples. They looked for the best preserved parts, a thick piece of tooth, a dense fragment of bone from the skull itself, where tiny strands of genetic material might have survived. The dry desert climate of Paracas, which had preserved the textiles so beautifully, acted as a natural freezer, helping to protect these fragile biological clues. The goal was to extract mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA. This isn't the main blueprint of your entire body. It's a smaller, tougher piece of genetic information passed down directly from mother to child. It's perfect for tracing ancient family lineages, for asking the question, who were their ancestors? The DNA results weren't what anyone expected. The prevailing theory was that the Paracas were a local population, descended from the first waves of people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. Their DNA should have shown them to be the ancestors of later Andean cultures, like the Nazca and the Inca. But the genetic story was more complex and far more interesting. When researchers analyzed the DNA, they found something startling. The Paracas elite showed signs of being a remarkably isolated population. Their genetic markers, their haplogroups, were distinct. Some of these markers are very rare today. This is what scientists call a founder effect. When a small group breaks away from a larger population and becomes isolated, their specific genetic traits become magnified in their descendants. This is the real speechless moment. It was about discovering a lost branch on the vast human family tree. The Paracas weren't just another tribe, they were a unique founding population with a genetic history that had been lost to time. Their DNA suggests a profound and ancient separation. They were not simply the same as their neighbors. This genetic isolation could explain a lot. It could explain why their culture, their textiles, their burials, and yes, their skulls, was so unique. They were a people marching to the beat of their own drum, both genetically and culturally. The Paracas were indeed humans, but not in the way we expected. They didn't fit neatly into our textbook maps of how populations were supposed to move and mix. They were a unique, isolated thread in the human tapestry, a thread we didn't know existed. Their identity was not just skin deep or even bone deep. It was coded into their very cells. They were a people set apart, and their extreme cultural practice of headbinding may have been a powerful physical manifestation of that profound separateness. They were, genetically and culturally, in a class of their own. The genetic evidence brings us to a profound conclusion. The Paracas were a uniquely isolated and fascinating branch of our own human family, and once we understand their biological origins, we can finally appreciate them for what they truly were: a civilization of stunning artistic achievement. To understand the Paracas, you don't need to look at their skulls. You need to look at their clothes. When the tombs were opened, the real treasure wasn't the bones, it was what the bones were wrapped in. These individuals were buried in some of the most breathtaking textiles ever created in the ancient world. We're not talking about simple rough-spun blankets. We're talking about complex, vibrant masterpieces of art and engineering. The colors are still stunningly vivid today: deep crimsons, bright golds, and rich blues. They achieved these colors with incredibly complex formulas, using minerals and plants that they expertly prepared and fixed into the fabric. The wool itself, often from vicunas, is incredibly fine and soft. But the true mind-bending part is the weaving. A single Paracas textile could contain over 200 different shades of color. They wove intricate patterns featuring gods, condors, serpents, and strange part-human, part-animal figures. These weren't just random decorations. They were a visual language, a tapestry of their beliefs and cosmology. The skill required is almost unimaginable. Weaving a single large mantle of this complexity by hand could have taken an entire lifetime of dedicated work. This was a society that invested generations of human effort and supreme artistic talent into the simple act of wrapping their dead. This changes the entire story. A culture capable of this level of artistic vision, technical knowledge, and sustained collective effort is not a primitive tribe. This was a sophisticated, highly organized, and spiritually profound civilization. Their mastery of color, pattern, and complex symbolism reveals a deep intellectual world. When you see the breathtaking skill in their textiles, the headbinding suddenly makes a different kind of sense. This was a culture that believed in transforming the natural world into something more beautiful, more meaningful, and more divine. They did it with thread and dye, and they did it with the human body. The skulls were not a bizarre anomaly, they were part of a consistent cultural package. The same society that wove impossible beauty into cloth also believed in sculpting the human form into what they saw as its most elite and spiritual state. The same hands that could mix 100 colors and tie 1 billion microscopic knots were the same hands that gently, persistently, shaped the heads of their children. The real mystery of the Paracas is not a biological what, it's a cultural why. Why did they pour such immense resources into burial shrouds? Why did they choose head shaping as their ultimate status symbol? These questions lead us into the fascinating and complex mind of a lost people. Echoes of Atlantis. When we're faced with something as strange and wonderful as the Paracas skulls, it's almost a natural human reflex to reach for a grand, sweeping explanation. The idea that their unique identity points to a lost super-civilization, like Atlantis or Mu, is a story that has captivated people for generations. But it's worth taking a moment to ask ourselves, why are we so drawn to these narratives? What need do they fill in us? On the surface, the appeal is simple. These stories are exciting. They offer a neat and tidy solution to a messy, complex puzzle. Instead of grappling with the slow, difficult work of archaeology and genetics, the painstaking analysis of bone fragments and textile fibers, we get a single, elegant answer. A highly advanced civilization, wiped out by a great cataclysm, whose survivors traveled the world, seeding knowledge everywhere. It connects the pyramids of Egypt to the mounds of Peru in one thrilling global adventure. This theory even has a name: diffusionism. It's the idea that major cultural developments like pyramid building or complex art didn't spring up independently in different parts of the world. Instead, they all diffused or spread from a single central source, a mother culture that was often imagined as more technologically advanced than any other. But there's a serious problem with this seemingly innocent idea. While it feels romantic, it often unintentionally robs ancient peoples of their own genius. When we look at the magnificent textiles of the Paracas or the towering monuments of the Maya, and our first thought is, they must have had help from a lost race. What are we really saying? We're suggesting that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were not capable of such brilliance on their own. This line of thinking has deep, uncomfortable roots. For centuries, Western explorers and scholars stumbled upon incredible ruins in the Americas and refused to believe that the native people they encountered, or their ancestors, could have built them. They invented stories about lost tribes of Israel, seafaring Phoenicians, or yes, survivors from Atlantis, because the alternative, acknowledging that these cultures developed in complete isolation and reached such heights independently, was to them unthinkable. It was a way of denying their agency, their creativity, and their intellectual power. The true story of the Paracas, the one being uncovered by science, is so much more impressive and respectful. It's a story of a uniquely American people, with a distinct genetic history, who looked at their world and invented a culture unlike any other. They didn't need outside teachers. They were the masters of their own domain, the innovators of their own destiny. Their achievement is not diminished by being homegrown, it's magnified. The Paracas didn't inherit their skills. They developed them through generations of trial, error, and artistic passion. The proof is in the cloth. No one gave them a pattern. They created a visual language all their own. No one forced them to shape their heads. It was a profound cultural choice that reflected their own unique beliefs about beauty, power, and the divine. The longing for a lost world like Atlantis is, at its heart, a longing for a simpler past. But human history is not simple. It's a rich, tangled, and beautifully diverse tapestry of countless cultures, each finding its own way to create meaning, to express power, and to understand the universe. The Paracas are a brilliant, vibrant thread in that human tapestry. To attribute their accomplishments to a fictional super-civilization is to overlook the real, tangible marvel right in front of us. It's like being given a handcrafted, one-of-a-kind masterpiece and insisting it must be a copy of something else, instead of appreciating it for the original work of art that it is. The real evidence-based story of an isolated people on a desert peninsula who developed a sophisticated society, unparalleled artistic skills, and a powerful cultural identity is a far more compelling mystery than any myth. It's a story that gives the Paracas their rightful place in history as the brilliant, innovative, and fully human civilization they were. The final verdict. The true revolution is happening among the geneticists and archaeologists who are watching the traditional map of human history be completely redrawn. The Paracas force us to confront a much more complex narrative of the ancient world, one where isolation created pockets of incredible cultural and biological distinctness. Their legacy is this dual identity. Genetically, they were a founding population, a thread of humanity that wove its own path. Culturally, they were visionaries, artists who wove their cosmology into cloth and who held a belief so powerful they encoded it into their very bodies. This brings us to the ultimate meaning of their famous skulls. They were not an attempt to imitate outsiders. They were the ultimate expression of an inward-looking culture striving to become the most potent version of itself. The Paracas looked at the soft, pliable form of a human infant and saw a canvas. With incredible willpower and cultural purpose, they dared to reshape it. They believed so deeply in their identity and their connection to the divine that they sculpted that belief into the bone of their children. They sought to transform themselves, not through a trick of birth, but by design, by conscious, sustained choice. In that ambitious, profound act, they demonstrated a form of advancement that goes beyond technology. It was an advancement of identity itself. The elongated skulls are not a question mark. They are an exclamation point. They are the permanent physical signature of a people who believed that the human form could be molded to reflect the power of their culture and spirit. They challenge us to expand our understanding of human history, reminding us that our past is far stranger, more diverse, and more incredible than we ever imagined.